Okay, in the next few lectures, I want to talk about Nozick. And Nozick defends a position that is in many ways just the exact opposite of Rawls. Nozick also takes himself to be working within a sort of Kantian framework. He also takes himself to be very concerned with rights. But at least when it comes to how we're supposed to distribute resources in society and what the rich owe the poor, or the less, the more fortunate owe the less fortunate, Nozick takes a line that's pretty much the opposite of Rawls. He pretty much says the government really shouldn't be in the business of making sure resources in society are distributed fairly. That's just not a thing the government should do. And he pretty much says, the better off don't owe the less well off anything, or at least they don't owe them anything simply in virtue of the fact that they're very well off and these other people are doing badly. Okay, so let's get into Nozick. And I want to break Nozick down to two parts. I think there's two interesting things going on in Nozick. And one is just a criticism of Rawls and Rawls's claim that inequality in and of itself is a reason for the state to step in and redistribute. Nozick will attack Rawls on this, and I think he has some very unsettling criticisms, right? And this shouldn't be limited in interest to just Rawls, because there are a lot of other people who say things like this, that inequality is a bad thing and the state needs to step in some way, do something about it, right? Lots of people on the political left, Bernie Sanders, for instance, most prominently, but a lot of others seem to have this view that Rawls does, that inequality is a thing that the state should be concerned with and it should step in to do something about it, right? And if Nozick really has a powerful criticism against that, then, I think that's pretty interesting, and not just because of what it says about Rawls. The other part of Nozick is that he wants to defend a very strong libertarian position, a very conservative position about economic questions. Nozick defends what he calls the so-called night watchman state. What does that mean? Well, it basically means that the state should just be a security guard and nothing more, right? The only legitimate thing that the state should do is to protect persons, people, our physical bodies, our persons, and our property. If the state does anything beyond that, it's really stepped beyond its legitimate boundaries. So I'll talk more about what this means in a second, a bit later in the lecture, but I want you guys to think a bit about what this means. If we accepted this argument, this so-called night watchman state, all the state should do is to protect people and their property. What would that mean? How would we have to change things? What does the government currently do that it would no longer do if we followed Nozick and said, okay, the night watchman state is all that we can have? Think about that. I'll say a lot more about it, but I want you to think about it yourselves for a second. What would this mean if all the state's supposed to do is to protect people and their property? Now, look, these two aspects of Nozick, I think, are separable. And I'm going to argue, I think Nozick's criticisms of Rawls and his criticisms of this claim that the mere fact of inequality is something the government should step in to remedy, I think those are actually more compelling and better than his argument for this strong libertarian position, this so-called night watchman state. But we'll have to see why that is. So as Dworkin said in the video I had you guys watch, kind of at the center of Nozick's work is this so-called Wilt Chamberlain argument. Now, I mean, the Wilt Chamberlain argument doesn't exhaust Nozick's book. It takes, I think, like 15, 20 pages in a 300 and some page book. But it really is important, and it really does get at sort of the meat of Nozick's arguments, the main line of arguments that he has. Now, it's a bit complicated because I think people sometimes misunderstand this argument. I even think Dworkin really wasn't quite fair to it. I don't think Dworkin really put it in its best form. So I want to say more about it and try to really give this argument the best possible account. Okay, so how does the Wilt Chamberlain argument work? So Nozick says, let's imagine that we step in and whatever distribution of income and resources in society you think is fair, we will do that. Let's suppose, we'll just start with Rawls because, you know, Rawls is the guy we've been thinking about. Let's suppose we step in and we redistribute everything in society so that the only inequalities we have benefit the least well off. Okay, fine, good. Everything is just now according to your model, right, Rawls? Okay. But let's suppose that there's a basketball player everyone wants to see. You know, you can think of it as a rock star, basketball player, whatever, right? Nozick's example was a basketball player, but it's not important. His example was Wilt Chamberlain, very famous, very good basketball player in the 70s. If you want to update it to LeBron James or, you know, whoever, feel free to do that, right? Anyway, not important. So let's just imagine that everybody wants to see this guy play basketball. He's just amazing, right? So this basketball player, Wilt Chamberlain, in Nozick's example, negotiates a deal with the team. He says, look, I'll get $1 out of every single ticket you sell. Not only that, but Nozick says, well, let's imagine that everybody who's buying these tickets are aware of this, right? You know, maybe, you know, when you buy the ticket, you have to tick a little box that says $1 goes to Wilt. You know, Nozick even imagines everybody dropping $1 in a box as they go in this, you know, to see the game. That's a little outlandish, but whatever. Let's just imagine everybody knows $1 extra from every ticket goes to Chamberlain, right? Well, what's going to happen? 1 million people, let's say, buy tickets over the course of the season. Remember, a lot of people want to see this guy play. Well, before, we had a perfectly just system where everybody has the amount of money they're supposed to have. According to Rawls, all the inequalities benefit the least well off. You know, if you like some other distribution, you think some other way of slicing things up is fair, you know, doesn't matter. Nozick's objection will work for that too, but we'll stick to Rawls. Well, now the problem is that Wilt Chamberlain has $1 million more than the theory says he should. Well, why is this a problem? I think people often interpret Nozick's argument in a very stupid way. And Nozick kind of encourages this. And, you know, that argument is, well, you know, now that Wilt has $1 million too much, the state's going to have to take every dollar away from him, or just tell people they can't see basketball games to maintain the distribution. That's not the issue. That would be a stupid objection, right? Because, of course, Rawls wouldn't say that we should apply things in that way. Rawls would say, well, that's dumb. Rawls would say, well, really what I think you ought to do to maintain the distribution is just as, you know, as Wilt earns this extra money, make him pay a much higher marginal tax rate, you know, like 70, 80, 90% or something, right? He'd still be free to earn the money. It's just he'd have to pay a whole lot of taxes on it, right? So I think a lot of the ways of interpreting the Wilt Chamberlain objection are stupid. And I don't think they're what Nozick is getting at. I think what Nozick is getting at is this. Look, if you are Rawls, you would say, well, Wilt getting this extra money is in some way unjust. We have to redistribute it either in a smart way, hopefully, or, do something about it. But Nozick's question is why? You say it's unjust. You say that it's unfair. But where's the injustice? Who has been wronged by Wilt having too much money, and how have they been wronged or harmed or treated unjustly? How in the world could anyone be treated unfairly here, right? Everyone who's involved in the transaction, people who pay money to see Wilt play and Wilt himself, agree to it, right? If you don't think it's a fair deal, you don't have to buy the ticket. If Wilt didn't think it was a fair deal, he didn't have to take the deal, right? If everybody involved is choosing it and they think it's a fair deal, how is there any injustice, right? Nozick would say, point to me by the people who suffer an injustice, who are treated unfairly, who are wronged or harmed by Chamberlain having too much. It's stupid to say that it's Chamberlain. He negotiated the deal, and he could always give the money away if he doesn't want it. It's stupid to say it's the people who paid to see Chamberlain. If they didn't think it was a fair deal, they wouldn't have to pay in, right? Well, you might say, well, society in general's harmed. Well, Nozick would say, well, that's also just kind of silly, right? How are, society at large, the people who aren't involved in this at all, how is a random person with no connection to Chamberlain harmed by the fact that Wilt Chamberlain has too much money, according to Rawls's theory? Somebody half the country away, he's not even affected by Chamberlain having too much money, right? It doesn't look like. How does that, if he's not even involved in this transaction, how has he suffered an injustice? How has Chamberlain treated him in any way unfairly? And Nozick would say, this is a sort of little toy or model example to simplify things, but Nozick would say this holds for whoever, right? If it's Chamberlain, people want to see him play basketball. If it's, if it's Steve Jobs and everybody wants to buy Apple computers or get an iPad or an iPod, well, people who want to buy the iPads or the iPods or the Macs, they can choose. Steve Jobs and the other people in Apple get their money. How were any of those people harmed? You don't have to buy a Mac. Jobs wants the money. If you're not even involved in the transaction, how does it hurt you that Steve Jobs or whoever has too much money, right? And so Nozick would push this even further, and he would say, look, Chamberlain or Steve Jobs or the head of Pfizer or whoever has some right to their property, right? You, Rawls, admitted with your first principle of justice that people have a right to property. Well, if people have a right to something, as we've seen, the only thing that can trump that is another right, right? Why in the world would anybody have a right to Chamberlain or Jobs or anybody else's property, right? If they haven't been treated unfairly, if they haven't been treated unjustly, what gives them a right to this person's property? And if they have a right to their property, but no one has a right to take it, then the state would do the wrong thing by coming in to take their property. Nozick would say to Rawls, look, you need to give me some account as to why this unfair distribution really is unfair to any person. You say it's unfair in some abstract sense, it doesn't fit with your model, but you tell me, Rawls, who has been treated unfairly. And if you can't find anybody, then you don't have a case for why the state is justified in stepping in and redistributing people's property to fit your model of fairness. Now, Nozick would say, now look, Rawls, yes, it might make people happier to redistribute. The people who don't have money might be really happy to get some of Chamberlain or Jobs or whoever's money, but that's just utilitarianism, right? If we're thinking about rights, you need to give me some reason, something that trumps these people's right to their property. The fact it doesn't fit your model, abstract model of fairness, doesn't give a reason, right? So Nozick, and I think this is important, will say that his theory, this Wilt Chamberlain example, proves that principles of justice ought to be historical. Why does Wilt Chamberlain have a right to his money in this case? Well, we start from a position that's just, right? Everybody has a right to their property. We've stipulated that it's just because we distribute it according to whatever model we have, right? Well, the transfers themselves are just, right? People chose to spend their money. There's no force or fraud here. They pay to see Wilt Chamberlain play. They get to see Wilt Chamberlain play, right? So the money they transfer to Chamberlain himself is just. Nozick will say that shows that Chamberlain has a right to this property. The history matters. The fact that Chamberlain gets it through just transfers matters. And so Nozick actually brings up his own two principles of justice. And these are very different than Rawls. Nozick says it doesn't matter if they fit some abstract idea that you, Rawls, or anybody else has about what a fair distribution looks like. That does not matter. What matters is the process itself. Not if it fits some model, but whether the process that has led people to have this property is a just one. And, is it a just one? Well, two things determine whether the process of you coming to have a piece of property is just. Can it be traced back to some just original acquisition? At some point in human history, things were unowned. Nozick says by working on them, by laboring on them, you can come to own these things. Once people make this original acquisition, they claim unowned things. After that, well, is there a string or a series of transfers that are themselves always just? A just transfer is one like the one he thinks of in the Chamberlain case, where each person knows what they're getting and agrees to it, the deal, right? If there's force or fraud or theft, then Nozick would say that's not a just transfer. But as long as you can trace your ownership of a piece of property back to just acquisition, and there's a series of just transfers, and only just transfers connecting it to that original acquisition, that original coming to own something that wasn't owned, then Nozick will say that history is what matters. If that's the case, you own the thing in question. Doesn't matter if it fits Rawls's abstract model or any other abstract model somebody might cook up.